So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate you giving up your time in this way, and we hope we can make it worth your while. So today we're going to talk a lot about our bodies, how we view them, and in a lot of cases hate them. How they do weird things and feel things from the past in so-called body memories. How they're susceptible to disease and dysfunction, and especially so in the light of trauma. And really, it's a relatively new idea that trauma might have an impact on our bodies. It ought to be absolutely obvious that trauma is about the body, but it's not. It's often an afterthought. We think that trauma is all to do with our minds, and we're often surprised to come across this concept that it might have something to do with our bodies as well. But trauma has everything to do with our bodies, as I'll go on to show. It is a supremely physical phenomenon. Trauma is not just something that affects us psychologically. Trauma is rooted in our body's reactions to life-threatening events. And some of the most devastating consequences of early childhood trauma are actually physical ones, as I'll explain shortly. So what is trauma? Trauma's not just having a bad day. Trauma is something that is way beyond our ability to deal with. It's something that pushes us beyond our normal coping capacities. And as a result, it may be something that our mind cannot process or deal with. When bad things happen, when stressful things happen, we can usually process them. We talk about what happened to us, we might cry about it, we might rage about it. But ultimately, we accept that this bad thing happened. We feel the feelings it brings up, and it becomes part of our narrative history. But trauma is different. Trauma is so overwhelming that we often can't process it or deal with it. We don't have the words. We don't talk about it. It doesn't become part of our narrative history, that bad thing that happened to us. It stays silent. Our thinking front brains, involved in memory and speech, shut down. Our survival-based back brains elicit extreme reactions in our body of fight, flight, or freeze. And we can struggle to assimilate what has happened to us as something that has happened, or even as something that has happened to us. Bessel van der Kolk defines trauma as an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms people's existing coping mechanisms. The American Psychological Association defined traumatic stress as involving intense fear, helplessness, or horror. I'd add another aspect to it, and I'd define trauma quite simply as life-threatening powerlessness. I believe that powerlessness is the very essence of trauma. Powerlessness is both psychological and physical, and for us to recover, we need to tackle it on both levels. We'll look at a little while about what goes on in our bodies at the moment of trauma, and how trauma, this life-threatening powerlessness, kickstarts a series of physical responses that are designed to help us out short term, but can become problematic for us in the long term. So the short-term physical reaction to a traumatic event that's meant to save our life and keep us safe from an attacker, that can actually become a long-term body and brain disease that kills us. And the irony for us as trauma survivors is that we spend our whole time looking nervously and hyperattentively for the threat out there, when all along the real threat is in here, in our bloodstream and in our brain chemistry. So trauma can impact our bodies in terms of our brains, in terms of our major organs such as our heart and liver and pancreas, in terms of our immune system, and in terms of a disruption of the stress response system of the body itself. And I'll explain all of this shortly. But trauma also changes our mindset. Trauma leaves us with a trauma worldview. And many of us experienced various forms of trauma in early childhood, things like abuse, chronic neglect, attachment disruption, or even abandonment, and medical trauma. And all of that had a profound effect on the way that our brain organises and processes its experience. Because trauma gears us up to focus primarily on sensing and responding to threat. So our brains don't focus primarily on play and relationships and joy. Our brains focus on what will help us survive. And when we lived in situations as children that threatened our survival, our brains had to make that their default focus. So we became great at surviving trauma, but it left us with brains that were geared towards expecting threat, even when it's not there, and being over-prepared to respond defensively to it. This trauma worldview tells us that the world is not safe. In the past, we've had dozens or hundreds of experiences of being overwhelmed when threatened. So we can end up believing that we're still powerless now to act effectively in the face of threat. And that trauma worldview infects not just those of us who've survived trauma, but many of you who work with us as well. The tendency is to believe that it's not possible to recover from chronic trauma. Not really. I mean, look at how damaged we are. Look at how messed up we are. Look at how difficult we find it to engage in therapy or access healthcare. Look at how impossible we find it to manage our emotions and our triggers. We live with unresolved trauma ruining our lives, and many people therefore believe that we can only recover a bit, if at all. Within the DID world, we're encouraged to just come to terms with our dissociativity. Often we're told that the best that we can hope for is stable multiplicity. Now, I'm not denying that the challenges are great. It's far from easy to recover from an entire childhood of overwhelming trauma, and I know this from personal experience. I developed DID, dissociative identity disorder, because from as young as I can remember, probably therefore younger, I was being sexually abused both within the family and in a number of organised groups and settings outside the home. And this is what some people term ritual abuse. It was extreme stuff. It involved extremes of coercion and torture and pain. It was degrading and humiliating and disempowering. It was deeply, deeply criminal. And it so overwhelmed my coping capacities that the only way my mind could cope was to dissociate and to develop multiple parts of the personality to try to segregate those experiences from normal consciousness. It seriously messed up my life. And in 2005, I suffered an overnight catastrophic mental breakdown where I went mad, as I put it at the time, literally in the course of one day. And it was nearly 10 years of quite intensive therapy that got me to the point where I'm at today. During that time, nobody waved a magic wand. I had to work really hard to recover, and many times I was tempted to give up even trying. But I'm so glad I didn't, because recovery really is possible. And as the title of my book says, recovery is my best revenge. But one of my principal motivations for recovery has been realising that trauma does not just have a psychological impact, but a physical one too. And that unresolved trauma is potentially the greatest threat to my physical health that I will ever face. I firmly believe that if we don't face and process our trauma so that it's neutralised, it will kill us. What's the point in us surviving if actually we don't survive? After the childhood I had, I want to do more than live a life of disability and pain and sickness before I suffer a premature death. In other words, I want to live before I die. So I'm passionate about this stuff that I'm going to be teaching today, because I believe that we can recover from trauma and that we must recover from trauma. We can't make friends with it and learn to put up with it because the physical effects of unresolved trauma are just too toxic. Let me show you what I mean with a few somewhat surprising statistics. There have been a number of studies over the years looking at the link between trauma, both in childhood and adulthood, and how that has an adverse impact on our long-term physical health. Prisoners of war from World War II were found to be 7.7 times more likely to have had a stroke at some time in their lives than were non-prisoners of war. Patients with both depression and heart disease are about 5 times as likely to die suddenly in the aftermath of a heart attack than are patients with heart disease but not depression. People with a history of repeated sexual abuse have a 62% higher risk of heart disease as adults. Women who've been physically abused in childhood have twice the risk of developing chronic fatigue syndrome and a 65% higher risk of developing fibromyalgia. If you have PTSD, you are 4.7 times more likely to develop irritable bowel syndrome. Childhood physical abuse is associated with a 49% increased risk of cancer in adulthood. And in a study that looked at people who have back surgery, there was found to be a failure rate of just 5% for people who'd had a non-abusive childhood. But that failure rate jumped to a staggering 85% for people who'd been sexually abused in childhood. So a number of traumatic or highly stressful situations there leading to significantly higher risks of disease. Childhood trauma and abuse is way worse for your health than smoking or pretty much anything. So there's a double whammy. Not only do you have the abuse in childhood, but then you risk getting sick as an adult because of it. How unfair is that? But as well as outraging me, it's also confused me for some time. Because surely trauma is psychological, isn't it? We're not talking about having broken our leg and it's not healed properly, so now we're on crutches. We're talking about something invisible, psychological trauma. And our confusion stems in large part, I believe, from the distinction we make between the body and the mind. Is this a physical issue or a psychological one? Do you have a physical illness or a mental illness? And we all know that if someone is stressed or distressed, that may affect their sleep. But how often do we say then that they ought to go and see a doctor about that, rather than, for example, dealing with it in therapy? And where did this division in our thinking come from? Who split up the mind and the body in the first place? If we go back to Aristotle, he observed that the moon had strange power over the tides. He believed that the brain is largely made up of water, so he reasoned that it was the moon which induced insanity in susceptible individuals. And this is where we get the word lunatic from, and the lunatic asylum. Luna is the Latin word for moon. Now, right from ancient times to medieval times to modern times, mental health problems have not been properly understood, and so they've been feared. In medieval Europe, post-traumatic flashbacks were a complete mystery, so they were deemed supernatural, beyond natural. Now, interestingly, if at the time someone rambled psychotically whilst feeling euphoric, and they were talking about the things of God, the medievalists tended to say that they were having a vision. They would call them a saint and revere them. But if they rambled incomprehensibly with negative mood, perhaps whilst being violent towards themselves in terms of self-harm, they would say that they were possessed by the devil. It's a fine line between sainthood and demonization. The unknown was the realm of the supernatural, which was the realm of the devil. Therefore, mental health disorders were deemed to be demonic, a view which is still frighteningly widespread today. So mental health gets a supernatural label, it gets a spiritual label, it gets a label as somehow being to do, therefore, with sin. So we get then the connotations of the lunatic as being evil, as being dangerous, perhaps as being subhuman. And that's the baggage, of course, that we still face today when we talk about having a mental health problem. Many of the anti-stigma campaigns try to point out that being mentally ill doesn't make you dangerous. But the sad thing, of course, is that there's such prejudice that it needs an anti-prejudice campaign in the first place. I wonder if anyone saw this headline in The Sun recently. The Sun's front page suggested that there have been 1,200 murders by mental patients. And smaller type, they point out that this is over 10 years. But of course, what you don't see on that front page is the context for those statistics, which is that only a tiny proportion of murders, about 5%, is committed by people with mental health difficulties. I prefer this alternative headline: 18 billion people killed by sane people. So going back to medieval Europe, specialist hospitals were built to treat, or rather to contain, these lunatics. Of course, they didn't offer any kind of treatment. They were, in effect, just prisons, which is how many people who've been sectioned on the NHS describe their experiences also. But at least we no longer tie up people with mental health disorders. This was widespread until 1793, when a psychiatric hospital in Paris brought in so-called humane treatment approaches, and they were the first to release their patients from their chains. So it's actually been only just over 200 years since those of us with mental health difficulties haven't been treated as sinners and criminals and chained up in a prison. And that's the backdrop to the mind-body split. It's okay to be physically ill, most people were. But if you were mentally ill, then you were seen as being dangerous and criminal and subhuman. And you might be locked up in chains to keep everyone around you safe. It was in that kind of a culture in the 18th century that René Descartes appeared on the scene. He's the chap that said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. Now that might not sound very profound, especially if you don't say it in Latin, but he developed a philosophical way of thinking, a fairly novel cultural paradigm that was largely born out of this need to get as far away as possible from diseases of the mind. And it's become known as Cartesian dualism. It basically says that the mind is one thing and the body is another. And it's claimed that this great groundbreaking philosophical thought was driven to a large degree not by high ideals and breathtaking genius, but as a result of a deal that Descartes struck with the Pope. Descartes was a physician, and he wanted to be able to dissect dead bodies so that he could study them. This was strictly prohibited by the Catholic Church at the time. But Descartes felt that it was holding back the advance of medical science, so he pushed and pushed until he eventually brokered a deal that would allow him to do whatever he wanted to do with the bodies once they were dead, as long as he agreed not to have anything to do with the soul, the mind, or the emotions. These were to remain the remit of the Church. So the mind and the body were literally cut up. Science claimed the body, and religion claimed the mind. Not because it's right, not because it's true, but because of the political ramifications of the Enlightenment and the ongoing battle for territory between science and religion. And as a society, we went along with it, probably because it meant that we could distance ourselves from diseases of the mind and all the sin and criminality and violence that were associated with them. These character judgments on mental illness were seen very clearly still at the beginning of the 20th century. Many soldiers in both world wars were shot for cowardice when they were suffering from shell shock, what today would be diagnosed as PTSD. Their symptoms of trauma were dismissed as moral failings and they were executed for it. It's unbelievable really, isn't it? We know from many of the people who get in touch with us at PODS that it's an awful lot harder to get welfare benefits for mental health problems compared to physical health problems. And part of this is because of this idea that mental health problems are to do with being lazy and cowardly and weak, which is the same judgment on our character as it was on the soldiers with shell shock. The reality is that the symptoms of trauma don't affect people who are good or bad. The symptoms of trauma affect people who have been traumatised. So let's take a few moments there just to process what I've been talking about. What is your experience of mental health attitudes? In what ways do you see the mind-body split in your professional work? Why do you think that trauma leads to such increased risk for major disease?